Hi, everyone. We are in our final lecture, final video, final week of lecture for this class. And this week, I'm going to be talking about Freud and Du Bois. Okay, no, it is not pronounced Dubois. He pronounced his name Du Bois, so we're going to pronounce his name Du Bois too. Okay, so let's do a little bit of review. Hopefully, remember what micro-interactionism is, where you talk about how individuals on a micro level are able to interact with one another and how those interactions shape how they see the world. See if you can describe semiotics, right? Particularly talking about the idea of the sign, the object, and the interpretant, and what those three different things are. See if you could do examples of those. What is the connection between microinteractionism and semiotics? Why is understanding semiotics necessary for understanding microinteractionism, right? So that would be a great question, for example, an essay question on an exam. That leads us, of course, to Cooley. His major concept was the looking glass self, right? Where he talked about the idea that we present ourselves to others, others judge us, and we react, change our behavior accordingly. And he, of course, focused a great deal on his kids, right, developmentally, which leads us to that concept of phenomenological empiricism, right? Where your ability to get into somebody else's shoes, understand what's going on in their head, understand the phenomenon in their head. Right? So see if you can go back, see if you can define that too. How is it that other people become real? Well, they become real when we're able to attribute an imagined inner life to them, right? When we are able to imagine that they have the same rich thoughts, history, experiences that we do ourselves, then they become real to us. Which is why Cooley says that fictional characters can actually be more real to us than random people who we walk by on the street every day. But we can criticize Cooley's looking glass self, right? Because it doesn't necessarily say how society gets into people's minds, right? And that is where Mead comes in. What do we remember about Mead? He was Cooley's student, and he took that concept of the looking glass self and ran with it to come up with his law of three stages, right? And he said, just remember the sentence, I play games, imitation, play games. That's the order. That first, humans, when they're very young, when they're babies, imitate others. Then they start playing, right? Pretending to have roles. And finally, in the game stage, they're able to have a generalized other that's able to be in their head. And they're able to understand that other people play a different role in society than they do. He has the concept of the I versus the me, where the I is your very impetuous, impulsive self, right? That's why they always begin with I's. I'm trying to help you remember that I is impetuous, impulsive. I want it now. Whereas the me is much more about what society wants from us. So using the law of three stages, we can see that over time, children develop a me. Society gets into their head and they start understanding what they should do. I already answered that. Yes, good. Okay. And the generalized other is, of course, society in your head, right? What is the best evidence that someone has a generalized other? They have the capacity to feel shame when they've broken a norm. Today, we're going to be talking about Freud's concept of microinteractionism, because Freud did talk about microinteractionism too, just differently than some of the people who we've studied thus far. We're going to talk about the differences between psychology and sociology, because there are differences, obviously. They're different fields, and relate them to some of the other theorists who we have studied. All right, so think about what you know about Freud already, right? You've probably seen like caricatures of him in pop culture. People talk about him being really focused on, for example, what's his most famous, well, one of his most famous concepts is the concept of penis envy. Obviously not something that we ascribe to in modern times, this idea that women apparently have an envy of the penis, and that's why they don't act in ladylike ways. No, clearly this is not the case, but you probably have heard about Freud a little bit. So let me tell you a little bit about his history, because it is important for you to understand the socio-cultural background that he's in. So he's born right smack dab in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, dies right before World War II, so right after the Great Depression. He, of course, is known for the concept of the id, the ego, And the superego, sorry, recording this at like 1 a.m. um, and the idea of the repression of the unconscious mind. So let me describe what these concepts are to you. The id is actually Latin for it, like it is the Latin word for it. Ego is the Latin word for I. That's the pronoun I, like I am here. Superego means literally above I, okay? So you can imagine, do you guys remember those things that were in playgrounds when we were kids? Seesaws? I don't know, maybe in the South they call them teeter-totters or something like that. You should think of the ego, the id, the ego, and the superego as a seesaw, okay? The id is on one side of the seesaw in one seat. The superego is on the other seat. And the ego is that thing in the middle that helps it balance. And that is basically the concept of the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is full of your desires for sex, for food, for violence, all those things that are all about desire, okay? Whereas the superego is all about what society wants you to do, just like Mead's concept of the me. And the ego is the part of your brain that balances the two, right? Because Freud said if you go too far in either direction, it leads to mental illness. If you go too far to the id, if you're all too far about desires, then he said that led you to mental illnesses like, what did he talk about? He talked about things like depression. He talked about things like, what's another one? Bipolar. They didn't call it bipolar back then, of course. Right. So if you went too far, you went into that type of mental illness. Whereas if you were too far on the side of the superego, you would have anxiety, like we would call generalized anxiety disorder today, right? Or things like anorexia. You were too focused on what society wanted out of you. So it's better, he said, for the ego to be there and balance them. You have some desires, but you also control them. Sometimes your desires get the better of you. Sometimes you're able to control them. The ego's in the middle, balancing the two. And he also said that individuals repress our unconscious mind and our unconscious desires because society wants us to. Society causes us to repress what we actually want so that we are acceptable to society. He was born in Austria to very poor parents, trained as a medical doctor in Vienna, which is, of course, in Austria. He developed the concept of psychoanalysis, which is talk therapy. Seems kind of obvious to you and to me today that talking about your emotions, talking about your problems would really help a lot. But prior to Freud, that wasn't really a thing. And the idea of the libido, the sexual drive that he said that all humans have. He was Jewish, so he fled the Nazis to the UK because, Nazis not so much fans of the Jewish people. He got oral cancer from all the cigars and actually was euthanized because he could not take the pain anymore. His most famous book is called, in English, the translation is usually Civilization and Its Discontents. The actual German title is Das Unbehagen in der Kultur, which literally translates to the uneasiness in culture. And I hope that you see the difference between what the literal translation of that title is and what we as English-speaking people have done to it. And please note that they give you very different ideas about what the book is about. And the German title is actually a better synopsis of what the book is about, because he's not actually talking about the discontented people in civilization. He's talking about how there is a general uneasiness in our society and our culture, and that is because of this idea of repression. Okay. Id, more formally, the part of your psyche that desires and wants. It's focused on self and instant gratification, right? So, there's donut. I'm going to eat it. That's your id talking, okay? Your ego, again, literally Latin for I, is the part of your psyche that determines rationally how to fulfill those wants and desires without too much pain. It's the part that comes up with rationalizations and defense mechanisms for staying in bed or for eating that cookie. So if you have ever said to yourself, I'll stay in bed a little bit longer because that'll make me really well rested later to write that paper, and I'll write a better paper if I'm well rested. That was your ego talking, my friends. Right? It's the part of you that's the middle of the seesaw that says I want to stay in bed. I want the cookie, and has to figure out what's a societally accepted way for you to get the cookie. Okay? For you to stay in bed, what have you. The superego, the above I, the part that aims for moral perfection and identifies with the authority figures, it stands in opposition to the id. So this is society controlling you and telling you what you should do. So when you got up early to go exercise or to write the paper, or you wore the appropriate clothing for a situation, that was your superego doing the work there. So can we relate this to Mead's I versus me? Yeah, obviously, right? I mean, the ids, it doesn't map on perfectly, guys. Like, they are different concepts. I don't want you to be like, oh, it's the exact same thing. No, it's not. The id is close to the I, right? I want it now. But the me doesn't actually map on perfectly to this super ego. And there is no like concept of the ego for me. So again, these concepts don't map on perfectly, but you can relate them. It's the same general idea. All right, so let's talk about his most famous book, Civilization and Its Discontents. He wanted it to be read as like an update to macro level social theories like Durkheim about the nature of humans, right? What are humans actually like? And what is the social contract? So what do I have to give up to society to have society protect me? Right? That's the idea of the social contract. What freedoms do I give up in exchange for society's protection? Freud says that the individual looks for freedom, society looks to repress, and thus we have this constant uneasiness in you as an individual, because you, to be a member of society, to be part of the social contract, have to constantly be repressing your desires. Okay? And whether or not that desire be for food, for being lazy, for sex, for whatever, you as a member of society have to constantly repress yourself. And Freud says that makes you uneasy. That makes you, if you go too far in either direction, have mental illness. That's where that's come from. He assumes that we all have strong drives for what he calls the pleasure principle. Anything that involves making us feel good. Sex, aggression, gluttony of all kinds. This is what Freud assumes, that we all want those things, okay? So let's take a look at your reading. It's on the website for this week. In all that follows, I adopt the standpoint that the inclination to aggression is an original, self-subsisting, instinctual disposition in man, and I return to my view that it constitutes the greatest impediment to civilization. So this is exactly what I just said on the previous slide. He is saying that in humans, our original disposition, so our when you get to the core of us as humans, who we are at the core is about aggression. Okay, our instincts are to be aggressive, right? I want to have sex with that person. I'm going to grab them and rape them. Okay, that's what Freud is saying, that's who we are at our core. And those instinctual desires, those desires inside of us, are what stop us from being civilized. So therefore, because we need civilization to survive, right? We need society to survive. Our brain has to figure out a way to stop ourselves from being that aggressive. Okay, so therefore, individuals and civilization are in conflict. But what does that mean? What are the aggressive drives in humans? Let's do a little bit more detail on that. All right. At its core, Freud says that we have two desires, two drives within us that he calls eros and thanatos. And it has become a lot easier to explain thanatos since those Marvel movies came out with Thanos, because that's actually a really good metaphor for thanatos. So in ancient Greek, eros stands for love, like intimate or romantic love, sexual love. Freud calls this the constructive drive or the life drive. This is the drive that leads you to want to have sex and construct a family, right? This is the let's put things together drive, right? Eros, constructive drive. Thanatos is the death drive. And Thanatos was one of the ancient Greek gods of death. Not the main one, but one of them. And this is where actually they got Thanos' name, right? Because, of course, didn't he kill like, I don't know, forget what percentage of the population, but when he snapped that gauntlet thing, it killed off some percentage of the population. Somebody's going to email me about this and answer that question. I just know it's coming. But anyway, he killed people, right? And that's where they got the name from, because Thanatos was a Greek god of death. So because Thanos killed a lot of people, they gave him the name Thanos, which is short for Thanatos. Anyway, so if Eros is the constructive drive, Thanatos is the destructive drive, what he calls the death drive. And this is represented by human aggressiveness. I'll go back to that. So this is the drive that makes you think, what would happen if I punched that guy in the face? Right? That would be destructive to your life, right? If you punch somebody in the face. Another part of this that he says is really interesting is what we today would call intrusive thoughts. If you've ever had the thought when you're driving, what would happen if I turned the wheel a little bit and went off the overpass? What would happen if I turned the wheel and went into incoming traffic? What would happen if I dropped this baby? Freud would say that's your destructive drive, your death drive coming out. It's not about the fact that you actually want to kill yourself. It's not about the fact that you actually want to kill the baby. It's just Freud says that we have tendencies towards wanting to destroy things. And oh my goodness, wouldn't it be a really big thing to destroy someone's life or destroy our own life? Again, it's not that you necessarily want to do it. Freud is just saying that everybody has these thoughts. Ergo, you should just be aware of the fact that you have these two drives within you, constructive and destructive, and they're constantly at war. This struggle, so the struggle between constructive and destructive, the struggle between Eros and Thanatos, is what life is about. And the evolution of civilization may therefore be described as the struggle for the life of the human species over these two things struggling within us, over the death drive. Okay? So therefore, we as humans, we have these individual drives warring in our head, but we also have to be part of society. So therefore, society has to help us control these drives. Okay? And Freud says that society comes up with socially acceptable ways for you. Oh yeah, these are some pictures just to help you remember. Freud says that society helps us by coming up with socially acceptable ways for us to repress our death drive and channel our life drive or love drive, whatever you want to call it. Okay? So how do we get rid of the death drive? His aggressiveness is introjected, internalized. That means that the aggressiveness is pointed back towards yourself. It's sent back to where it comes from. That is, it's directed towards his own ego. There it is taken over by a portion of the ego, which sets itself over against the rest of the ego as the super ego, right? Remember that the super ego was symbolizing society, and which now in the form of conscience. Everybody knows what a conscience is, right? It's that thing that tells you you're supposed to do good things and makes you feel bad, right, if you do bad things, is ready to put into action against the ego the same harsh aggressiveness that the ego would have liked to satisfy upon other extraneous individuals. The tension between the harsh superego and the ego is called by us the sense of guilt. Okay, so here's a really good example of this. If you have ever stayed up at night and thought about the stupid thing that you said 3 years ago that honestly nobody is thinking about anymore, guys. But if you have ever stayed up at night or, thought, oh my God, I'm such an idiot, years after the fact, that was your conscience at play. Freud is saying that that is you, instead of putting aggression towards other people, putting aggression towards yourself. Because it's not socially acceptable to put aggression towards other people. It is socially acceptable for you to have that conscience and sense of guilt, that sense of, oh, geez, I really screwed up there. Okay? Some of the other ways that we can channel the death drive, if it doesn't work to have our aggression goes towards ourselves and be mad at ourselves for things, Freud said that, for example, sports, particularly professional sports, are a great way to channel our drive for aggression, right? Because professional sports, honestly, you're not going to take part in them. Let's be realistic for a second. Unless you're the truly unusual person who's going to go play in the NBA, NFL, what have you, you're going to watch them, okay? You're going to be a spectator. But Freud says that the great thing about professional sports is that you can, through the players on the field, imagine yourself as one of them and work out your aggressive drives that way. So if you've ever had the situation where your team, is doing really poorly and you get up out of your seat and start yelling at them, or your team is doing really well and you get up out of your seat and start cheering. Now, I hate to break it to you, they can't hear you. You're in your living room, okay? But Freud is saying that by doing these things, by feeling like we're having some sort of input on something that's happening miles and miles and miles away from us, even if you're in the same stadium, they probably can't hear you, that we are channeling our aggressive drive, okay? You get the point? Hey, who else talked about a sense of guilt? Mead did, right? Mead said that we know that we have internalized the generalized other when we are able to feel shame. Freud is using the exact same evidence here. When humans feel shame, we know that the society has gotten into their head. Okay, but what about Eros? How do we channel our constructive drive? Have you ever heard of something called the Oedipal complex? Okay, I'm going to take a sip of tea and then I'm going to explain to you what the Oedipal complex is. All right. So Freud said that boys are born with what's known as the Oedipal complex, which is based off of a play that was written in ancient Greek called Oedipus Rex. The story of Oedipus Rex is that there was this king and queen, and they had a baby boy, okay? And the soothsayer, who was like a prophet sort of thing, told them that someday that baby boy would kill his father and marry his mother, okay? So the king and queen obviously did not want that to happen. So they put the baby up on a hill and left the baby there and said, oh, we'll just have another kid. And the baby was found by a shepherd who brought him to a king of a neighboring kingdom who had no sons. And the king of the neighboring kingdom adopted him. And then he became king of that neighboring kingdom, right? Oedipus. That's the baby's name was Oedipus. And then eventually he started war upon his original parents' kingdom, not knowing that they were his original parents, killed his father and married his mother, thus uniting the two kingdoms. And obviously he did not know he was killing his father and marrying his mother. But Freud said that boys have the drive to kill their father and take their place with their mother, okay? Whether one has killed one's father or has abstained from doing so is not actually the decisive thing. One is bound to feel guilty in either case. So long as the community assumes no other form than that of the family, the conflict is bound to express itself in the Oedipus complex, since civilization obeys an internal erotic compulsion which causes humans to unite in a closely knit group. Okay, so let me break this down for you because you're probably got a very strange expression on your face right now. And what is she saying? What's going on here? What is Freud saying here? Freud is saying that, and please note how sexist this is, right? Because he's talking about boys. Boys have this innate drive towards wanting to construct a family, towards wanting to have sex. And the only person who's really around them who is a sexually mature female is their mom. And so thus, this is why boys want to use their aggressive drive to kill their father and marry their mother, right? And obviously this is not socially acceptable, right? So instead, boys grow up, rebel against their father, and marry somebody who's like their mother. So if you've ever heard the saying that, like, oh, he married his mother, right? Where when a guy marries somebody who's very similar to his mom, Freud would have been like, yep, I told you so, okay? Because that's the whole idea that boys want to marry somebody, they want to marry their mother, so they marry somebody like their mother, okay? Freud also vaguely talked about something called the Jocasta complex, which was just reversed, girls wanting to kill their mother and marry their father. Like if you heard the concept daddy's girl, or you know, if somebody has daddy issues, so they date guys who are not good for them, that's where that comes from too. Freud would have been like, yep, I told you. People want to marry their parents. And now you're probably thinking they're like, nope, I don't want to do this. Well, okay, that's fine. This is what Freud was saying. Therefore, any constructive impulse is bound up in eros, right? In love, in sexual love. The sense of guilt from wanting to kill your father and marry your mother is the conflict between the id that wants that constructive sex and the superego, which is like, don't have sex with your mom. That's gross. Which says, you know, sex with parent is bad. So therefore, the ego is in charge of like balancing the two. And the ego says, okay, I want to have sex with my mom, but society says I can't. So I'm going to grow up and marry someone like my mom, right? Do you see how there's like the compromise there? All right. So thus, How does the individual interact with society? The two urges, one towards personal happiness and the other towards union with other human beings, must struggle with each other in every individual, right? So you want to be happy, but you also want to be with other humans, and that limits your happiness. So like there's a struggle there. And so also the two processes of individual and of cultural development must stand in hostile opposition to each other and mutually dispute the ground. So what you want for yourself as an individual and what society wants are in opposition to one another. So therefore, how does the individual interact with society? In conflict, right? The individual knows that they need to be part of society, but they don't want to because it hurts them. That's what Freud is saying. So is that true? Do you think that being part of society hurts the individual? Can you contrast this with other theorists who we've read, right? Durkheim definitely wouldn't have said that being part of society hurts the individual, right? Because individuals come from society. I don't know that Mead would say that society hurts individuals. He would say that society gets into individuals, right? And we could talk about a lot of other theorists who we've read who are similar to this. So does this necessarily solve his micro-macro issue? Does this solve the fact that Freud says that individuals affect society and society affects individuals? So we have to figure out, how is the superego formed? And how does society get into each individual's mind, right? Because Freud just says, hey, there's this superego thing, it's in your head. But he doesn't have, like Mead, the law of 3 stages, right? He doesn't have a way for society to get into your head. He just says that it does. It can be asserted that the community, too, evolves a superego under whose influence cultural development proceeds. It is based on the impression left behind by the personalities of great leaders, men of overwhelming force or mind, or men in whom one of the human impulsions has found its strongest and purest expression. Now, what on God's green earth did that man just say? What is he saying there? He is saying that not just individuals have a superego. He says society also develops a superego. What? What does that mean? Okay, think about it this way. You have heard the story of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree. This is, by the way, is a made up story. It never happened. But anyway, I'm quite sure you have heard this story, haven't you? Right? Where George Washington is the little boy and he chops down the cherry tree and he says, oh, I cannot tell a lie. Right? And he tells his father he chopped down the cherry tree and takes his punishment. Now, why did somebody make up this story? And why is this story still so prevalent today? Like, why do we still tell kids this story? Freud would say that George Washington has become for us a cultural superego because our society values honesty. Therefore, we have to come up with myths with figures in our society who stand for honesty and have them be somebody who we look up to, okay? And because George Washington is one of the founding fathers, just someone to whom we look up, we tell this story because we treat him like a cultural superego of honesty. So some of the other things that we could talk about as being cultural superegos. Let me see if I can think of another one. Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa was known for caring and compassion, right? She's actually a little bit of a problematic figure. She said some not great things about suffering and poor people. Look it up if you want to. But it doesn't actually matter because we use her as a cultural superego of somebody who is kind and compassionate and caring. So it doesn't actually matter to us that she was a good person or bad person in real life. It's just the fact that she's become the symbol of the thing. And we value her because she has this symbolic nature to us. She gives us someone to look up to. She gives us someone to aspire to be. Okay? So Freud says that we develop these cultural superegos because it gives us as a culture some way to influence individuals. If we value these people, then they will get into our heads as someone who we want to be like. Ergo, our superego will start making us act like those people. Therefore, the processes of the development of the individual and culture are interlocked. Freud would say that you can tell a lot about a culture by who their cultural superegos are, Who are the heroes in that culture? If you tell me who the heroes are in that culture, I can tell you what that culture values, and I can tell you what type of individuals are in that culture. Okay? This is why, for example, heroes differ by culture. Heroes in Chinese culture tend to be much more about the group, right? Helping out the group because they're more group. Asian societies tend to be a bit more group based. American heroes tend to be much more individualistic, right? About like, oh, it's the individual is going to take care of him or herself. It varies, right, by different societies. So Freud would say that as the individual develops, as does the society. As the society develops, so does the individual, that the two things are locked. So whether or not you think that solves his micro-macro ratio, frankly, I think it's a little bit weak myself. He is attempting to try and do it. He's just saying that the two processes go in concert with one another. He's not necessarily saying, how those individuals get into our heads. The micro-interactionists would turn around and say to him, yeah, that's nice. Your theory is great, but it's missing that really important mechanism of how does society get into individuals' heads. So therefore, let's move on. What are the discontents of civilization? I think more accurately, we should ask who. He says that the discontents of society are those individuals whose ids place them in opposition to the repressing forces of society. Now, remember that the repressing forces of society are internalized in your head as the superego, right? Okay, good. So can we relate this back to Cooley and Mead? Yeah, we can, right? We've already talked about how Mead would have thought about this theory, that he would have agreed that we have, desires within us and that society controls them. He wouldn't have loved the fact that Freud doesn't actually talk about how society gets into the mind. He just says that it does, right? So it's missing that mechanism. So why is this considered psychology and Mead sociology? What do you think? Look, I'll give you my answer. I'm hoping that you guys will all come up with your own answers on this one. But I think I consider this psychology because Freud is all about what's happening just in the individual's head. He doesn't really talk about how society affects the individual. He just says that, hey, we want to be part of society. Society represses the individual. It's kind of weak, in my opinion, as a sociologist, right? Of course, I'm biased for assuming that society affects the individual. Durkheim, right? I'm biased towards Durkheim, that it's the people around us who do it. Whereas Freud would have been like, nah, stuff really happens within the individual's head. That's what we really need to look at. So I think it's more about the focus. But I'm hoping that you guys come up with your own answer to this. Particularly interested in hearing from those of you who are psych and social majors, how you think this fits into the world. Okay, thus ends part 1.